Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
Hi, I'm Rick Heemstra. In today's episode, we're going to hear from Amy Vetter. Amy recently completed a Master's in Leadership and Management at Briercrest Seminary. She looked at women leaders' experiences in evangelical churches that have recently changed their policies to allow women to serve in leadership positions. Lindsay Calloway talks with Amy about what it might mean to encourage and help women to see a path forward toward their calling. I think you'll find it particularly interesting to hear Amy talk about why culture is more important than policy when it comes to making room for women leaders. And don't forget to stick around after for Lindsay and I to talk about our own impressions and thoughts about Amy's research.
Amy, your research asked what the requirements are for women to flourish in ministry leadership. And you used a research method that really invited in and worked with your experience to guide and instruct your process. Can you tell us about how your personal experiences prompted your research?
Yeah, for sure. So for 10 years, I've been a kids pastor, and my journey has been through different types of churches. I grew up in a very complementarian setting, and as I stepped into my first ministry role, I found myself in a church that was in the process of changing their policy around the roles of women in leadership. And for me, that was a very empowering and exciting time in ministry, where I was being invited into and allowed to step into places that lined up with my gifting, but that I had never imagined myself taking. And so from there, when I moved to another place for ministry, one that had had female pastors for several decades, I was really excited to see how a place that had been practicing this for so long would be for a female who wanted to be in ministry leadership. And I was actually quite surprised that I found myself much less empowered. And I kept running into these roadblocks along the way that made it really difficult to be a female in that workplace. And so that is really what got my mind wondering, what is it about churches and cultures, and how do we help women to flourish in the different places where they find themselves?
So I'm already hearing some buzzwords that we probably should define. And I know that the evangelical population is diverse on this topic, so we take that as a given. But could you describe what you mean by complementarian and then egalitarian?
For sure. So complementarian churches run with a male headship model. They believe that men and women are made to complement each other in the ways that they lead, but the men are the ones that take that primary place of leadership. And some typical places where boundaries are drawn are around preaching, around leading men in kind of supervisory roles and things like that. Whereas in the egalitarian belief, there's this kind of underlying belief that men and women are equal and they can hold equal roles in the church. So both men and women can preach, men and women can serve on the board, and things like that.
Okay, and then in your thesis, you say egalitarian belief or policy change toward egalitarian belief has not created flourishing for all women within ministry leadership. So I wonder if you could flesh that out in two ways. First, how do you understand what it means for a woman to flourish? And then second, how do you create or cultivate that?
Yeah, for sure. So within my survey, I define flourishing this way. To flourish means to thrive, to have a space and an opportunity to grow, to use your giftings and to be able to contribute to the team and mission in a meaningful way, to be equipped, empowered, trusted, and treated equitably, no matter your personality or gender.
That's great. And then I guess I'm really asking for you to get into the meat of your findings. I'm just wondering, what did you find? How do you create or cultivate this flourishing in a ministry leadership context for women?
So through my research, I found that the findings were really forming a bit of a picture. So this idea of a garden. So if we're looking at a garden, what are the things that plants need to flourish? They need different nutrients to be in the soil, things that we can add in, and sometimes things that are innately there. And then there's also things in the soil that make it difficult for plants to grow and to flourish. And so those represented the depreciative findings in my research, things that need to be taken out of the environment. And then there's just common ways that different plants need to find flourishing. So different pH levels in the soil or different amounts of light and those types of things. And so within my findings, that's how I broke it out. So the appreciative elements fell under the categories of people, systems, and cultural realities. So for women to flourish in ministry leadership, they need 4 different kinds of people. And the ones that I found in my research were empowering supervisors, wise mentors, bold advocates, and diverse networks. And it's not that male leaders don't need those things as well, but for female leaders, it's often more difficult to find those types of people to be a part of your leadership journey. And then within the systems, women need visible career pathways. They need to be able to see the next steps as they continue to grow in their leadership. And a big part of that would be leadership scripts. So being able to watch another woman in ministry leadership and to be able to say, oh, that's what it looks like when a woman preaches, when a woman is leading a meeting, when a woman sits on a board of elders. Those are things that really help women to be able to see what flourishing looks like and then to be able to walk their story in similar ways. Another really important thing that I found in my findings were just the significance of human resources. It's often something that in churches we're a little bit behind the culture in being up to date on how can we really help our employees to be their healthy and best selves? What does it look like to consider sabbaticals or to consider maternity leaves? What does it look like as we've just been through COVID for sick days? What about if our employee has children that have sick days? What does it look like for us to give space for our employees to be not just the person at work that's working, but also their holistic selves? Mm-hmm. And then lastly, those cultural realities. So things like open communication, gender representation, and accountability. Those are really important cultural realities that women need to be able to flourish. And so those were the appreciative things that I found through my interview research as well as through the survey research that followed.
That's really great, Amy. And it sounds like a lot of those things are things that men and women could benefit from in general. So what makes women particularly in need of some of these appreciative elements?
Yeah, for sure. So I think because in a lot of our ministry leadership settings, they've for a long time had a lot of male people in those roles. And so as women stepping into those roles, we often still have very traditional lives at home. We have kids that we need to look after and juggle different schedules. There's the different kinds of, meal prep and grocery shopping and all of those pieces. And so women often don't have those same abilities to be able to put in the long hours, have those relationships with those key people. And that's, I think, really where the depreciative findings came in. A lot of them were around this idea of access. So things like the Billy Graham rule and things like the Old Boys Network make it really difficult for female leaders to have access to the places where decisions are made, to the places where recommendations are made for promotions, where people build rapport with colleagues or even with networks to be able to have opportunities to try new things and to be able to develop skills that perhaps you don't have in your current role.
Could you define the Billy Graham rule for those who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, for sure. So the Billy Graham rule, as its name denotes, was one that Billy Graham and other very popular speakers had, in which a man and a woman were never to spend time alone. So things like being in an office with a closed door, traveling to and from places, different off-site meetings, and those types of things.
Okay. And so things like that in the culture of a workplace would limit access to people or to opportunities. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. So they would limit access to people. So someone in a church setting like a lead pastor or a supervisor or somebody who's leading a committee around something. When you're not in those rooms where just those kind of back and forth conversations happen, you often miss out on things and people forget to circle you in on what happened behind those closed doors, or on the drive to a conference, on the drive back from a conference, those types of things.
So some of those more casual but integral parts that contribute to a team culture or to even just a career path, like you were saying earlier, formulating those scripts and establishing a pathway. Some of that actually happens not so much on paper, but around the lunch table or in the car. Some of those more casual interactions would be missed out on, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right.
And then you also had this idea about the genetically modified plants, or the ones who adapt. And you talked about, I think you referred to them as outliers. They're women who've found a way to thrive in environments that aren't necessarily built for their thriving or flourishing. And I found this so interesting because I've come across this in my own context as well. And I've always referred to them as exceptional women who are women of exception. And they just tend to find a way around some of the traditional maybe barriers that other women have. So can you tell me a bit about some of these ways that women have found to flourish in settings that aren't necessarily designed for their flourishing?
Yeah, so this category of outliers was really surprising for me in the research. And I, like yourself, have run into this in my own journey. And I've always wondered, what is it about these women that makes them be able to succeed in the ways that they do, despite all of these things that seem to be challenging in their workplaces? So out of the research, there was 3 categories, and there might be more as further research is done. But one of them is women who hold traditionally female roles. So things like kids ministry, women's ministry, missions. Those are things that have been true in the church environment for a long time, that women have been in those roles. And so there's often a lot of space. They have this almost like their own little realm where they can lead and they can train volunteers and they can, work with those groups in ways with lots of freedom and empowerment. Another category was women who I describe as having a strength of personhood. So these are just women who have really strong personalities. Interestingly, in the research that I did, a few of them grew up outside of the church. And so they didn't have kind of that framework in their mind of what they could do and what they couldn't do. And so they just leaned into places and they just led with this freedom that a lot of us who have grown up in more traditional contexts have not had. And so that was the second category of these outliers of women that can really find success despite some of these obstacles that are in their way. The last one I described as women who have favor or skill to be able to navigate the ministry culture. So they've got really good, just emotional intelligence. They're great at reading the room. They're good at knowing who to talk to about different things and how to perhaps work around some of the systems that are very structured and holding in place, but yet they've found these ways and they found favor. They're often very respected. They are looked well upon by everybody within the leadership culture, and they often find ways to be able to kind of take it to the next level and have promotions and lead in different ways. And it just no other way I could find to describe it, but just having this favor upon their leadership.
And do you think that these women who kind of fall into the 3 categories that you've identified, do you think this is something that should be emulated, or is there still work to be done in order to create paths for other women to thrive? How do you reconcile sort of this idea of this garden, but then there's also these seeds that are more just apt to flourish? Or should we be promoting one over the other, or should these women, are these the kind who should be in leadership? What do you do with that?
Mm-hmm. I'd say that these outliers are part of the complex picture of helping women to flourish in ministry leadership, because particularly in evangelical and egalitarian churches, these leaders often look to these women and they say, look, we're doing it really well. Look at them thriving, and they've been in this organization for 20 plus years and we're just really doing well. And then the other women who are not having that same experience kind of fall under the radar, or it starts to become about them as an individual. And it's, they don't have the skills necessary to be able to succeed in their role and to really thrive as a pastor. And so that makes it really tricky when we're looking at how do we help all women flourish, because it is undeniable, and it was clear in the research that there are women who are flourishing in ministry leadership, but then there's also other women. And so I think the more that we can have a conversation, not only as women, but also just as teams around what does this look like for each individual. As I asked the different research participants, they each had a slightly different answer of what flourishing looked like for them and what kind of those requirements were for them in their own stories. And so I think it's really easy for us to want to paint everybody with the same brush. But in order for all women to flourish, we need to look at what does each specific woman need to flourish in the role that she's in, and not just look at kind of these tall poppies that have found ways to be able to really succeed in the place that they're planted.
Sure. And now, you've finished your thesis and you've graduated. What would you like to see come from the research that you've done? How would you like to see churches and other maybe ministry organizations adopt what you've learned and put it into practice? How do we move from that policy to actual practice?
Yeah, certainly. So I think one of the really important things that I wanted to do as a part of this research was to make what has been invisible visible. I think many women have this experience of struggling and not sure what are these things that they're running up against that are making their career and their job difficult. And so I've hoped that through this research, as people dig into it, they can begin to see and develop a language around how do we talk about our experience in leadership as women? What are some of these things that are roadblocks, these things that maybe are landmines that make it hard for us to do well? And how do we talk about that with men? Because they have a very different experience. And if we can't communicate those things, it's hard for us to work together and to help each other to do well and to flourish. And so I hope that from this, there's been a bit of a language that is developing around how do we talk about our experiences. I think it's really important to bring women together, just to talk about what does flourishing look like and what has our experience been? Because I think a lot of women think it's just me. I'm the only one that's having the struggle. Maybe I'm not cut out for ministry. Maybe I wasn't called into this. And I think when we hear the stories of other women, we can see, oh, there's something bigger going on here. And there's actually ways to navigate in these cultures. And there's things that we can ask for. We can ask for time to be able to spend with the people that make decisions. We can ask for a mentor that can walk alongside with us, that knows what the journey looks like and can give us just that wise counsel as we go. And we can develop networks of other leaders around us. And that's often something that female leaders haven't been very intentional about, is just developing what does that network look like that I can just discuss what has your experience been, what has my experience been, and how can we learn from each other.
Yeah, I like that idea of really kind of bringing this into conversation. And you mentioned in your thesis this idea of like a hidden curriculum and, like you said, making something invisible visible. And so I am interested, did you find any ways of how we can talk about this? How do we open up the conversation in a way that invites people in rather than really entrenches them? Because it can be a polarizing issue, especially if we start to use gendered language or if we start to pit different perspectives against one another. What are ways to have this conversation charitably, to communicate the needs of women without maybe necessarily demonizing the men that we work with and potentially for? Because really, I guess if we all image God as male and female, there is something inherently good about the two working together. So how do we open up the conversation in a way that invites rather than entrenches, you think?
I think something that's becoming more popular within ministry leadership has been the use of different personality profiles. And I think when we can have the conversation about how is each person unique, rather than always just categorizing people into male and female, I think that gives a lot more space for people to be able to speak up about what their experience has been and to be able to share the things that really help them to flourish. I think, sometimes we just have to be bold in having the conversations too, and just to be really humble and really charitable about it. there's so many male leaders that want to see women thrive and they want to see them do well. And they're not even aware of the very subtle things that they might say or do that create these barriers or cause women not to speak up and share what their opinion is. And so I think when we can just say, when you use he every time that you're talking about this new role that we're hiring for, that makes me feel like I shouldn't recommend the position to my female colleagues. Those are a few ways that we can just create some of those conversations. I think, the work of Brene Brown has been really helpful for me. So if there's been an experience where two people have butted heads and they're seeing things differently, just saying, the story that I'm telling myself is this. And I'm not sure if that was your experience in that conversation as well, or if you have a different perspective. But I just wanted to check the story I was telling myself with you, and I hope that we could have some more dialogue around that.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. And earlier you had mentioned this idea of calling. We might have these exceptional outliers, but then if a woman doesn't feel like they fit that profile, then they might question their calling. What role does calling play into ministry leadership, do you think? And how does a woman discern it?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say that calling looks different for different people, whether they've tried ministry and really felt like, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be, or whether they had a really specific moment with the Lord where they just felt his call in their life to be a part of ministry. I think it's something that as we journey as leaders, we can look back and be reminded. And that's where community has been really important to me. When things get difficult, to just have that conversation and for them to remind me of those good moments, for the ways that I just light up when I talk about what it looks like to pastor. And so I think for women, we often don't see ourselves in those places of pastoring and of leadership within ministry. And so it becomes really important that we have a way to be able to view our journey and the ways that the Lord is leading us into the places that we're going. And then when things are difficult, we can look back at those moments and be like, the Lord has been faithful. He's been inviting me into these places, and he's been giving me this community around me that can encourage me as I continue to step out boldly into those places.
Right. And that really brings in, that idea of having these people who can support you and having that access, all of these elements that you've identified that really contributes to the cultivation of flourishing. And it reminds me of our podcast with Margaret Clark, who talked about this idea of theological meaning making and how important that was for clergy flourishing, which I think she was a reader on your thesis, no?
Yes, that's correct.
I see elements of that in your description of calling as well.
Certainly. Yeah, it is important for us to be able to do that meaning-making work in our stories to help the pieces fit together, and also just to give us that encouragement as we continue to lean into those places that are perhaps more difficult.
So, Amy, I'm thinking about churches that might want to access your thesis and learn from it. How can we get in contact with you or access your thesis for any listeners out there?
Yeah, for sure. So I have my thesis posted on my social media channels as well as on my LinkedIn. I have my social media is called Women's Flourishing Collective, and so they can find it there as well as on my LinkedIn for Amy Vetter.
Great. We can link that to the show notes as well. Amy, thank you so much for your insight. Do you have anything else to add? Just one final thought or surprising finding that you think is important for us to know and to think about as we think about women flourishing in ministry contexts?
I think it would be an encouragement that no matter where you fall on the theological perspective, that, my research findings made really clear that policy change isn't actually the most significant part of women finding flourishing. And so whether you're in a complementarian church or you're in an egalitarian church or a church that fits kind of somewhere in the middle, there's things that we can do to help to just encourage and empower women to lead in the ways that they're invited to in your church context. And so I think that there's lots within my thesis that offers some of those practical tips and ideas of ways that we can engage this conversation together and to really just seek after this kingdom vision that Jesus has given to us and just continue into this next season of the church.
Thank you so much, Amy.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Lindsay, a really interesting interview. What were your thoughts about what Amy had to say?
None of it seemed that surprising to me. It seems natural and, I think people assume that there are systems and cultures, especially in workplaces, that can be ingrained and maybe established that tend to prevent other people. And I would say this probably extends even beyond women, but Amy focused on women, but that do prevent certain people from truly stepping into certain roles or achieving their calling because of these cultures that have been created. And so some of it wasn't that surprising, but it was maybe confirming of some of the things that I've seen and maybe experienced myself in certain contexts.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of churches, you have maybe powerful leaders in positions that protect those positions or protect traditions. And sometimes traditions can be good. I'm not one of those people that says that because it's traditional, it's necessarily bad. But I think that this idea of calling that you're talking about is very important. I think what we want to do is to make sure that the people that are called aren't prevented by sort of our systems or practices or customs from answering the call that God has. I guess I would see calling as something that kind of has two parts. You have a calling from God, but also a calling that's confirmed from the church and God's people. And especially for ordained ministry and those kinds of positions. But, I think Amy has a good point too, that you need people to recognize the calling in your life and to call it out, right? To speak it over you and to say that I see this kind of gifting in you. And I think that God is calling you to do this. Like there's something really powerful about just vocalizing those words, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. My husband has this 3-part calling interpreting kind of framework that he always helps, because he's a young adults pastor. So he's always talking about sort of vocation with young people. And he says, is there desire, is there opportunity, and is there affirmation? And a lot of times, not all 3 of them align. And even when I was at home myself, I really felt this kind of stirring to do something else. And I had desire and I had affirmation, but I didn't have opportunity. And I really just took that as God's way of telling me, this isn't the season right now. So that's been kind of my own way of understanding calling in my own life. But I think that affirmation piece is key. And the fact that Amy was mentioning that a lot of women don't have some of those networks of support, those people in place, that maybe that's why they seem to fall to the wayside a little bit more in certain situations. And that's whether you're, called into leadership or even just called into a role of influence. I just wonder if there's a lot of women can tend to be crippled by this sense of insecurity. I think that's maybe it might be a stereotype, but there is this sense of I'm not equipped. I don't know what to do, or people would look to me as an expert and I don't feel like I am an expert in areas. So what do we do with expertise and this sort of equipping? Do you think you have to be equipped in order to be called?
Yeah, everybody's not equipped until they are equipped. And often it is the question of the opportunities that the communities around you give you. And I think that there is a place, for us to be on the lookout. I noticed that in Amy's language, she used a lot of language of vision, right? Do I see myself there? Do I have a pathway forward that I can see? And that's really important. I think that we give young women and young men a vision for what can be, because often this is a very common theme for young adults generally, that they can't see a vision of the future. And so they kind of get stuck. We don't want people to get stuck simply because they lack that vision. One of the things that I think about calling, and that we were maybe talking about a little bit earlier, is the idea that gifting and calling are necessarily the same thing. I'm always reminded Moses in the Bible, when God called him at the burning bush, he said, and he was trying to get out of it, of course. But he said, God, I don't speak well. And God really took him to task and said, I will put my words in your mouth. And there's this idea that if you're called, that God can still supernaturally empower you for what he's called you to in spite of your gifting. And sometimes, I think in the evangelical church, we got this wrong with our spiritual gift inventories that we did probably around the 1980s, where we equated natural gifts with the spiritual gifts and callings. And they could be the same thing, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And this is why I think in the church we need to be listening to the voice of the Spirit when we are thinking about people, because their natural giftings may not actually be the spiritual giftings that God has given them. And we need to create a space for those giftings to flourish. When I was growing up, I grew up in the home of an immigrant, and this was in the early 1970s. When I grew up in Listowel, Ontario, it was still very much an Anglican town, right? And it seemed that at that point that the world would never change. Even though I'm a white man, I wasn't an Anglican man. I was son of a Dutch immigrant. It makes me conscious that there were systems in place that really did privilege certain groups. And the world, I think, in many ways has changed since then, at least in Canada, and sort of disturbed the norms and allowed us to see different possibilities. And, I'm not one of these people that says, let's change for change's sake because all change is good. But if we have become settled in things that don't line up with God's will, then sometimes I think it's a good thing for us to be disturbed a little bit in what we're accustomed to in order to see. And I think that maybe this is some of what Amy is trying to get us to see, that sometimes we have these systems and these received ways of doing things that prevent us from seeing what God may be calling women in particular to do.
Rick, you were a pastor for several years and then moved into a researching role. What do you do with some of the residual call to the pastorate? How do you see it? How do you just kind of grapple with that call that might still be on your life in some ways, or some of the giftings that coincide with that while working in research?
Well, my call was to the re-evangelization of the church. And I thought, and this is where I think that Amy's idea of having a clear path forward is very important, because the path that I could see was as a pastor. Whereas here, I think at the EFC, I still have a way to contribute to the re-evangelization of the church through the research that we do that empowers and strengthens other evangelists. And maybe that's, a really good example of the way in which our vision can kind of limit and maybe inhibit our effectiveness as we answer and respond to God's call, that we and women need to be able to see those examples so that they have an idea of how they might serve God. Because we do follow pathways, we do follow scripts, we do follow roads, and we're going to take the ones that are most familiar because, in spite of our sort of North American idolization of sort of the strong individual who blazes their own trail, that's not what most of us do. And so we need that.
Any thoughts, Rick, about how that happens practically in the church?
I think the church, we need to be really bold to encourage people, especially young people, but not just young people. If we notice God's call on people's lives, we need to be a Barnabas, or I think Bar is the masculine pronoun, maybe a Barnabas, which would be the female daughter of encouragement, and come alongside these people and not hold off on that affirmation. Prayerfully, we need to be discerning. We need to make sure that these people are really called, because you can do a lot of damage in a church as well by sort of moving people into leadership that really shouldn't be there. But I think that too often we think that calling is an individual thing. And I think a lot of young people, they think that it's their job alone to figure out what that is. And I think that we can really bless people by simply attentively noticing how God's working in their lives and affirming them. Another thought I had is, whenever we talk about women in leadership in the church, there's always a sense that if somebody is pushing back on church tradition, that their agenda must be somehow to overturn orthodoxy in some way. And I think that we need to be sensitive to that. But I don't think that when we're talking about giving women a place and a voice in leadership and giving them room to answer God's call, that this is what we're talking about. Rather, I think that we're talking about really carefully listening to the Spirit. And I think, too, really carefully doing our exegesis. It's really carefully considering what our hermeneutic is around these things. And it's not about this group or that group. It's really about, as we do our hermeneutic and everything, what brings glory to Jesus in this culture and this time that is faithful to what the church has always held to be the core of the good news. And I think that this is the conversation that we need to have and what we need to try to get at together as Christians, and not to simply have one of these polarizing reactions that you often get on social media. And that's what I hope that Amy's research and other research and other conversations can lead us to do.
I was just thinking that if you are going to live with roommates, which I did for several years in college, the living arrangement isn't determined by just one person or one group of people. And I'm sure if I was living with a group for 6 months and somebody new were to come along, the culture of living and flourishing that we had established might not be as welcoming to this newcomer. And maybe they have a lactose allergy and we've just been, cooking meals with milk and cheese. There's just there are cultures that need to be examined when new people come along. It shouldn't have to always lead to a big overturn of established traditions or a question of orthodoxy. It can just be, what are the systems and patterns that we've established that can be changed? I think there's definitely layers to it, and changing one thing doesn't have to be questioning the deeper theological underpinnings of a church or of that tradition itself even. There's so many ways that we establish patterns and cultures in our lives that we invite people into that aren't necessarily built for their flourishing.
Lindsay, I think you make a good point, and I think we have to be careful that we don't confuse our culture with our theology. And I know that there's a relationship between those two, but we need to tease those two out.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.